Imagine a person who believes they are completely self-aware, someone who prides themselves on their kindness, rationality, and moral integrity. A person who feels they understand their own motivations and behaviors perfectly. Now imagine that same person discovering that large portions of their personality remain hidden from them, powerful forces that secretly drive their strongest emotions, their most puzzling behaviors, and their deepest conflicts. What if the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, and pushed away weren't truly gone, but were actively shaping your life from the shadows? Today, we will uncover the psychological mechanisms that Carl Jung, one of history's most revolutionary psychologists, discovered and documented throughout his life's work, revealing the invisible forces that influence your relationships, your decisions, and your perception of reality. And the final revelation will be the most powerful of all. It will change the way you see yourself forever. This is not just a theoretical discussion. This hidden dimension affects all of us. You might think that you know yourself completely, that there aren't significant aspects of your personality hidden from your awareness. But Jung's analytical psychology tells a different story. The terrifying truth is that each of us carries what Jung called the shadow, a collection of qualities, impulses, and traits that we've rejected from our conscious identity. Jung observed that the less we acknowledge our shadow, the darker and denser it becomes. And this shadow, though invisible to us, is painfully visible to everyone else. Carl Jung, who broke from Freud to develop his own school of analytical psychology, discovered through decades of clinical observation that the human psyche naturally splits itself. The parts we accept become our conscious identity, or what Jung called the persona. The parts we reject don't disappear, they form our shadow. Jung's years of research with patients showed that our sense of self is far more fragmented than we think. The shocking part: most people never realize these hidden forces are operating until they experience what Jung called a confrontation with the unconscious, a crisis or breakdown that forces them to face what they've been avoiding. But what are the mechanisms that create this shadow? What unseen influences cause us to reject vital parts of ourselves? That is exactly what we are going to uncover. The truth may be uncomfortable, even disturbing, but it is necessary, because only by understanding this process can we become whole, authentic, truly free from the invisible patterns that control us from behind the scenes. There are several factors at play, and each one is more insidious than the last. First, there is the formation of the shadow in childhood. It does not happen by choice. It begins with the natural human need for love, acceptance, and belonging. Jung explained that the child's psyche is highly adaptive, molding itself to fit the expectations of parents and society. A child might express anger only to be told, "Good boys don't get angry," or show sadness only to hear, "Stop crying," or "I'll give you something to cry about." These messages come from parents, teachers, religious institutions, and peers. Jung observed that the child simply hides these unacceptable qualities initially, but over time they become buried so deeply that the person loses awareness of them entirely. What once was a natural part of their personality now becomes alien, threatening, something to be denied at all costs. Jung saw this as a moral problem that challenges a person's entire sense of self. Then there is the mechanism of projection, which Jung identified as the most common way the shadow manifests in daily life. One of the most chilling psychological realities Jung documented is that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we see everywhere in others. Jung noted that the things that irritate us most about other people often reveal important aspects of ourselves we're unwilling to see. The traits that trigger our strongest reactions, particularly disgust, anger, or intense criticism, are often our own disowned qualities projected outward. Jung described projection as an unconscious, automatic process where what's unconscious in ourselves gets transferred onto others, making it appear to belong to them instead of us. Consider the man who cannot tolerate weakness in himself, becoming enraged at the slightest vulnerability in others, or the woman who represses her sexuality, becoming obsessed with judging the improper behavior of other women. As Jung observed in his clinical work, the shadow ensures that what we most deny in ourselves becomes what we most readily see and condemn in the world around us. But it does not stop there. Another key factor that Jung identified is the collective shadow that forms in groups. Jung explained how when people share the same blind spots, the same repressions, the same denials, they create a collective shadow. This explains why family systems often share the same taboo topics, why religious groups can enforce rigid moral codes while blind to their own contradictions, why entire cultures can project their disowned qualities onto other nations or ethnic groups. Jung was particularly concerned about this phenomenon after witnessing the horrors of World War II. He wrote extensively about how ordinary people were led to commit horrific acts because they were projecting their collective shadow onto an enemy. The phenomenon of scapegoating, placing society's disowned elements onto a person or group and then attacking them, represents what Jung saw as the shadow in its most destructive form. Think about how many conflicts in history, from personal feuds to global wars, were fueled by projection. Jung observed that the participants did not see themselves as acting out their own disowned qualities. They truly believed they were fighting external evil. And here is the most unsettling question of all. Could you be doing the same? Could you, right now, be projecting your own disowned traits onto people you blame, criticize, or cannot stand? Jung would suggest the answer is more complicated than you might think. And in the next section, we will go even deeper into the consequences of living with an unacknowledged shadow. The most shocking truth of all is yet to come. One of the most dangerous aspects of the shadow is its effect on relationships. Jung observed that people rarely recognize their projections, even when these projections are destroying their connections to others. Instead, they remain convinced that others truly possess the qualities they cannot acknowledge in themselves. This is where what Jung called emotional complexes reveal the shadow at work. When someone provokes an emotional reaction that feels overwhelming, disproportionate, or seemingly irrational, that's the shadow. Jung described these complexes as emotionally charged psychological patterns that are incompatible with our conscious attitude. Imagine someone who feels inexplicably enraged when a colleague receives praise. Rather than recognizing their own disowned need for recognition, they convince themselves the colleague is manipulative, undeserving, or insincere, or consider the person who feels intensely threatened by someone else's confidence, creating elaborate reasons why that person is actually arrogant or fake. The shadow doesn't just distort how we see others, it actively sabotages our deepest needs. This explains what Jung observed as repetition compulsion, where people recreate the same painful relationship patterns throughout their lives. Jung noted that until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we'll simply call it fate. A person who cannot acknowledge their vulnerability might continuously choose emotionally unavailable partners. Someone who has disowned their power might repeatedly find themselves in relationships with controlling individuals. The shadow ensures we keep encountering what we most need to integrate, but cannot yet face. But cognitive dissonance alone does not explain everything. There is another force that Jung identified, one that is even more insidious. It is the autonomous nature of the shadow. Jung discovered that the shadow isn't simply a collection of repressed traits, it functions as a semi-independent complex within the psyche. Jung explained that these complexes behave like animated foreign bodies in our consciousness. This explains why we sometimes find ourselves doing things that contradict our conscious values and intentions. In these moments, it isn't that we're choosing to act differently. It's that another part of us, the shadow, has temporarily taken control. This autonomous quality makes shadow material particularly dangerous when triggered. A person who sees themselves as perpetually rational may experience moments of completely irrational rage or fear. Someone who prides themselves on honesty might find themselves telling elaborate lies when feeling threatened. The shadow, when activated, can temporarily override our conscious personality, what Jung called possession by the shadow. And this brings us to one of the most dangerous consequences of denying the shadow: psychological projection on a mass scale. When enough individuals project the same disowned qualities onto the same target, societal scapegoating begins. Throughout history, societies have identified enemies who seem to embody the qualities the culture most fears or rejects in itself. The witch, who carries the community's disowned sexuality or power. The outsider, who represents the culture's denied vulnerabilities. The heretic, who speaks the uncomfortable truths no one wants to face. Jung saw this pattern repeat throughout human history and warned about its dangers. This is why throughout history, propaganda has been so effective at dehumanizing enemies. It speaks directly to the shadow, activating collective projections while bypassing rational thought. The moment a group stops seeing another group as fully human, moral restraints collapse. But here is the terrifying part. This process doesn't just happen on a large scale in wars or political movements. It happens in everyday life. It happens in families when one member becomes the designated problem. It happens in workplaces when colleagues become targets for collective shadow projections. It happens in relationships when partners project their disowned qualities onto each other, creating cycles of blame and counterblame. And it can happen to any of us. No one is immune. As Jung emphasized, we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. So now we must ask ourselves the most difficult question of all. If the shadow shapes our lives in ways we don't recognize, how can we bring it into awareness? The answer is not simple, but in the next part, we will uncover the path to shadow integration that Jung outlined in his clinical work. Because while the shadow always exists, it doesn't have to control us from the darkness. And the difference between a life controlled by the shadow and a life enriched by integrating it comes down to awareness, courage, and the strength to face what we've been avoiding. The first and most powerful step toward shadow integration is shadow recognition. Many people believe they have no significant shadow material simply because they see themselves as self-aware. But as Jung observed through decades of clinical work, the shadow by its very nature remains hidden from consciousness. In fact, the belief that I have no shadow, or I've already dealt with my issues, is often the surest sign of significant shadow material at work. Jung noted that it's usually the things we're not conscious of that affect us most. Shadow recognition means developing the capacity to see your own projections in action. It means understanding that your strongest emotional reactions to others contain valuable information, not about them, but about you. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is a necessary one, because only when we acknowledge our shadow can we begin to integrate it. One of the most effective ways to recognize the shadow is through what Jung called trigger awareness. When you find yourself having an emotional reaction that feels overwhelming or out of proportion, particularly intense anger, disgust, or harsh judgment, pause and ask yourself, what quality am I seeing in this person that I cannot accept in myself? Other powerful questions Jung might have suggested include, what about this person's behavior reminds me of qualities I try to suppress? If I possessed this trait that bothers me, what would that mean about me? What would happen if I allowed myself to express what I condemn in others? These questions force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that what we most judge in others often reflects our own disowned traits. Jung observed that when inner situations aren't made conscious, they manifest externally as fate. But awareness alone is not enough. We must also develop the courage to face what we've been avoiding. This is where shadow acceptance comes in. It is easy to acknowledge shadow material intellectually. It is much harder to truly feel and embrace the disowned parts of ourselves. Shadow acceptance means developing a relationship with the parts of yourself you've rejected. It means understanding that these qualities became shadow, not because they are inherently bad, but because they were unsafe or unacceptable in your early environment. Your shadow formed as a survival mechanism, a way to adapt and belong. But what once protected you now limits you. Accepting the shadow doesn't mean acting out every impulse or indulging destructive behaviors. It means acknowledging these aspects exist within you, understanding their origin, and finding constructive ways to integrate their energy. Because every shadow quality contains both destructive and creative potential. The aggression you've disowned contains the seeds of healthy assertiveness. The vulnerability you've rejected holds the capacity for genuine intimacy. The selfishness you condemn might contain legitimate self-care needs that have gone unmet. Jung called this process holding the tension of opposites, allowing seemingly contradictory aspects of the self to coexist. Another critical aspect of shadow work is developing what Jung called symbol awareness. Many of the mechanisms that maintain the shadow rely on keeping certain material out of consciousness. But this material doesn't disappear. It emerges through symbols, dreams, fantasies, and creative expressions. Dreams, in particular, often reveal shadow content through symbolic language. Jung considered dreams the direct expression of unconscious psychic activity. The figures that disturb or frighten you in dreams frequently represent your own disowned qualities. The situations that create anxiety in your dream world often point to the very challenges your shadow needs to face. By paying attention to these symbolic communications, you create a bridge between conscious and unconscious. You open a dialogue with the shadow rather than continuing to repress it. Jung dedicated significant attention to understanding these symbolic languages and their importance in psychological healing. But perhaps the most important lesson of all is this. Shadow integration is not a destination, but a lifelong process. Jung called this process individuation, becoming the unique, whole person you were meant to be. It is not about eliminating the shadow, that's impossible. It's about developing a conscious relationship with it, about bringing light to what has remained in darkness. In the final part, we will reveal the ultimate truth about the shadow. This is the final, most liberating force at play, and once you understand it, you will never see yourself or others the same way again. There is one final liberating truth that explains why shadow work transforms not just individuals, but relationships, communities, and societies. It is the force that underlies every aspect of shadow integration we have discussed, the recognition of projection, the acceptance of disowned qualities, the dialogue with the unconscious through symbols and dreams. It is the power of wholeness. More than any psychological technique, more than any spiritual practice, it is the journey towards psychological wholeness that heals the fragmentation within us and between us. Carl Jung called this process individuation, becoming the unique, integrated individual you were meant to be. Jung described individuation as the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, a separate, indivisible unity or whole. A person is not born whole or fragmented. They begin whole but become fragmented through the necessary but painful process of adaptation. And if the journey stops there, with parts of the self exiled to the shadow, they remain divided against themselves. But if they continue the journey, reclaiming and integrating what was lost, they discover something profound. The very qualities they most feared, rejected, or denied often contain their greatest gifts. The vulnerability they couldn't bear becomes the source of their deepest connections. The anger they repressed becomes healthy boundary setting. The selfishness they condemned becomes proper self-care. The sexuality they feared becomes life force energy. The power they disowned becomes purposeful action in the world. This is why no one can afford to ignore their shadow. It is not enough to simply live with half of who you are. You must actively engage with the fullness of your nature, both light and dark, conscious and unconscious, accepted and rejected. Jung emphasized that wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Because just as an unacknowledged shadow can destroy, an integrated shadow can transform. Jung observed that, in the shadow is the gold, meaning our greatest potential often lies in the parts of ourselves we've rejected. But here is the most profound question of all. If integrating the shadow unleashes such potential, such wholeness, such liberation, Why do we resist it so fiercely? The answer is both simple and profound. We resist shadow work because it requires us to surrender the illusion of who we thought we were in order to become who we truly are. It demands that we question our most cherished self-concepts, that we face our deepest fears, that we acknowledge capabilities for both creation and destruction, love and hate, courage and cowardice, that we embrace the full spectrum of our humanity rather than clinging to a sanitized version of ourselves. And most importantly, shadow integration requires that we recognize the line between light and dark runs not between people, but within each person, including ourselves, especially ourselves. This was perhaps Jung's most profound insight, that the battle between good and evil is fought not between nations or groups, but within the human heart. Jung observed that people often become neurotic when they content themselves with inadequate answers to life's questions. They pursue external success and remain unhappy even after achieving it because their lives lack sufficient meaning. This is the final truth. There are no people without shadows, just as there are no shadows without light. There are only human beings, complex, contradictory, and whole when they embrace all aspects of themselves. So ask yourself, are you ready to meet your shadow? Are you willing to face what you've been avoiding in order to reclaim the energy, creativity, and authenticity that await you there? Are you prepared to see not just the carefully constructed image you present to the world, but the full spectrum of who you are? Because in the end, the difference between a fragmented life and a whole one is not fate, it is choice, and that choice is yours to make every single day.